Without further ado, I'd like to invite Katie to come up to talk about the work at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Northern Westchester.
Hi, I'm Katie Alberti from the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Northern Westchester, and I'm here to talk about the process we went through to erect a Black Lives banner at our congregation, and then some other things that happened as a result of that. When I was in Paula Cole-Jones' session this morning about why is it so hard to get people involved in anti-racism work in your congregation, I was sort of startled to see what a contentious issue it had been for congregations to put up a Black Lives Matter banner. And I think it could have gone that way in our congregation, but we were lucky enough to have a process that helped pull us together instead of tear us apart. And I want to give you a little bit of background about the congregation. We are a congregation that's been between about 110 and 130 people as long as I've been there, which is 28 years. And there was a very strong story that the congregation told itself. It told itself, we can't get involved in political or controversial issues. And it was because once upon a time we did, and we blew up. At the end of the 60s, the early 70s, we had a minister who took a very strong stance against the Vietnam War. In fact, he went to the IBM shareholders meeting and stood up and berated this was a story, berated the chairman of IBM, and most of the men in the congregation worked at IBM. So the Board of Trustees did not find that very amusing, and he parted company. The congregation, shortly thereafter, went from about 300 people to 20 in a couple of years. There were a lot of other reasons, but the myth and the story, the belief in the congregation was that we can't have controversy and we can't get involved in social justice anymore. This is it. And when I joined in 1992, that was the story, and I had come from an activist congregation in Houston, Texas, and it seemed really weird, but these were nice people and they all liked each other, so it was working. Our building's tucked away in the woods in Bedford, New York, which is the home of Ralph Lauren and Martha Stewart. They don't belong. We don't get their use of their money. But on the border with Mount Kisco, New York, which is majority Latino, and in fact, the Bedford Central School District is busily trying people in the Bedford Central School District are busily trying to find a way to keep Mount Kisco out of their district, even though they're in it. And then to our north is Bedford Hills, which is a middle-class, has some middle-class Black communities, but we're in a white bubble, to put it bluntly. The congregation survived, like I said, it survived and it grew. And when Michael Tino, our current minister, came to candidate, he started talking about the J word, justice work. And we were kind of taken aback, and we sort of looked around at each other during the candidating sermon, but he is great, so we kind of said, okay, we can deal with that. And he ratcheted up and added a little bit more to the conversation over time. Then in 2015, I'm sorry, I'm old. 2015, Michael came back from General Assembly asking us to fulfill the resolution that was passed at General Assembly to support the Black Lives Matter movement and to start a prophetic witness against racism. We had come to trust his judgment. I was not on the board at that point, but he went to the board and said, I want to hang this banner, and the board said, sure, Michael, go for it. And I heard today that other congregations went through that same process. And it could have gone the same way it did in other congregations, but he left the board meeting and thought about it, and he thought, if I do this, we will have a banner out there, and everybody inside the congregation will be exactly in the same place they were when we hung the banner. So he came back to the board and said, I'm going to hold off on this until we work through this together as a congregation, and that this has to be validated by a vote at a formal congregational meeting. So he structured a whole series of discussions, workshops, and backed that up with putting something in the newsletter every week, linking to an article. Some of the topics we addressed, we read, as a congregation, we read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. He introduced the idea of my brain just went blank on it, the law of discovery. Doctrine of discovery, which divided the world into two separate spheres for the good Christian people, and everybody else could be your slave, and that's fine. And it still has a legal effect. I did not know this till I learned it in church. So this took 6 months, and we were a congregation, like I said, that really didn't get into this sort of stuff, but I think a couple things were happening. One is that we had a goal. Like I said, he hung this banner up in the worship room and said, we can't put this outside till we're ready to do it. So we had a goal. And the other thing is, at that particular time, the activism of the Black Lives Matter movement was making this a very vivid, was putting vivid representations of the injustice in our society on television every night. So it was in our face. So we had 35, 40 people at the discussion of Between the World and Me. We had regular potluck lunches to discuss these issues, and it did two things. And I'm going to say this in a selfish way. It not only raised our consciousness, it brought us together as a community around something really important. And we had discussions. We learned things about each other. For instance, one of my really good friends, who is, obviously white, but although she's half Indian, her grandsons are of mixed race. Her son-in-law is Haitian. He plays the bassoon and the English horn in the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, and he's regularly hassled on the street. I didn't know that. So sharing these personal stories really made this real for us. So then we came to the hard part, which was to take this to the actual congregational meeting and have a vote. We've had congregational meetings before where somebody says, I don't like that, and it shuts everything down. But generally, those were meetings where we hadn't thought this through as a congregation. In this case, we owned it together. So after 6 months of study, preparation, discussion, we had a congregational meeting, and normally we have a quorum of 25. Normally, we're like dragging people off the streets to get to that quorum. We had 50 people at the meeting. There was one abstention and a few questions, not about the Black Lives Matter banner, but about the actual resolution that had been passed at GA, which included things like abolishing I'm paraphrasing, abolishing elements of the criminal justice system. There was a little bit of, we're not quite there yet. One person abstained. Other than that, it was unanimous. So we hung the banner, and we were very happy. What's the result of that? Well, we've had 10 banners. They get stolen or slashed on a regular basis. We keep putting them back up. We had angry white, honest to God, angry white couples bang on the door and disturb our bilingual kindergarten director, demanding a white person come to the door and go take the flag down. These people went to the police, and the police said, I'm sorry, it's their church. They can put this banner up if they want to. That was like a real exemplar of white privilege. And I personally, at that point, I was the president of the congregation, picking up answering machine calls, and I called one person back who'd left a message, oh, I saw your banner, I'm so happy. And I called her back, she said, this is terrible, you have to take it down. So they weren't thrilled. On the other hand, we're on a very busy road, and Michael Tino, our minister, has been approached by many, many people who say, I'm a person of color, and it means so much to me to see that banner up there and to see that we are supported by this congregation. And it gives me strength. And we've had more people of color come to visit the church. We may not be quite there yet in terms of being an open enough congregation so that everybody feels comfortable, but people feel comfortable coming in and visiting, and we've had a couple of new African American members. So it was a process that isn't perfect. We're not totally there yet. We'll never be, but it really was worthwhile. Thank you.
All right, next we're going to have Michael Daly come up with from the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of South Fork. Woohoo.
Good afternoon. Just because we haven't doesn't mean we can't. It's a process. I was born and raised Catholic, classic altar boy, choir boy, parish council. And over the years, I've attended Presbyterian church, Episcopalian church. 25 years ago, I became born again. I accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, and I got a hall pass to confessions forever because no longer did I need an intermediary. But in truth, it also solidified my personal relationship with God. So. But I found the Bible church world to not be an ethos that I could live with long term. I found them patriarchal in nature. I recall first attending the UUCSF in Bridgehampton almost 4 years ago to this day. And someone had told me, they're a really nice group of people who are not stuck on religion. So I had to check it out. My first time, 2 times, I came late and left early, which is your classic way of coming in and not getting snagged or cornered by anybody. But each time I walked into a room with nearly everyone smiling, hugging, shaking and holding hands, and I'm like, it was like a scene from the movie Cocoon, you know? It was like, what got into these people? A bunch of retired white hippies is basically what I walked into. And jealously, many of them had been to Woodstock, and I was just a little too young to get there. On my 3rd or 4th visit, I read in the bulletin that the congregation was preparing for their new minister, Kimberly Quinn Johnson from New Jersey. So, of course, what did I do? Mr. Google, Kimberly Quinn Johnson. And up came several people, but finally settled on this Kimberly Quinn Johnson affiliated with the UU. And I said, that Kimberly Quinn Johnson? She was a woman of color. And I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. So maybe I am going to stick around here for a while because these people obviously have got something going on if they are picking a minister, a woman of color as minister. And it has been interesting, very interesting over the last 4 years. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're doing or have done, what we're trying to do, and then what we're struggling with. Since 2015, Reverend Kimberly has become an ordained minister, and this year our settled minister. I became her first new member recruit, and this past July was called as a reluctant president of the Board of Trustees. Reluctant not because I didn't want to serve or that I didn't feel like it was a good place for me, but reluctant because I didn't feel prepared to serve. But after the 6th time and looking around at who else, I said, okay, but I'm going to need everyone's support, and they have been very supportive, the rest of the board. Our meeting house has become a center for social justice meetings, although our congregation does not have a social justice committee. People from all over the East End come to our meeting house to gather with groups such as Racial Justice East End, the Organization for Latinx Americans. We host book readings such as New York Times bestselling author Mr. Colson Whitehead, who recently read from his book, The Nickel Boys, which follows 2 boys struggling through their sentences at an abusive reform school under the specter of segregation in the 1960s. We recently hosted activists from around the state and the New York chapter of the Poor People's Campaign as they toured the Shinnecock Nation, the Shinnecock Indian Nation in Southampton as part of their bus van tour, seeking to understand the struggle of communities directly impacted by governmental policies. We co-host the March for Interdependence, an alternative to the traditional Star-Spangled Bannered 4th of July parade, a family-friendly walk to peacefully advocate for the dismantling of policies leading to family separation at the borders, mass incarceration of women of color, and the tragedy of missing Indigenous women. We host an annual Seder and the Muslim celebration, Ramadan. Reverend Kimberly is a three-quarter minister who speaks at libraries, neighboring churches, and community centers throughout the East End. And she travels around the country working with youth and serving in leadership of Blue, Black Lives UU, and other UUA roles. We are truly blessed to have her as our minister, as I am blessed to have her as a mentor and a sounding board. My safe place to ask questions about how a person of color sees issues of white supremacy and patriarchy and how I conduct myself. Carol Holstein, here today, and her husband David have done services on their visits to historic civil rights sites in the South and to Nicaragua with a group led by the College of Social Justice and hosted by the UU Service Committee Stewardship Circle in 2018. Their trip was split between hearing from professionals outlining history, politics, and current situations affecting women and other groups, and then visiting with several grassroots groups dealing with women and the environment. Carol has also served on our board of trustees and in leadership for our Helping Hands Fund. David also serves along with former President Mark Potter on the board of the Long Island UU Fund, which provided grants in 2018 totaling $242,000. I represented our congregation at the Living Legacy Civil Rights Pilgrimage in March of this year with several people in this room, thanks to Reverend Hope and Dr. Janice for their guidance. And I was there with Amy and Kimberly and Margaret and Linda, and it was a life-changing experience for me. We invited our members to attend the fall program. I held my first service this summer on dismantling white supremacy and patriarchy, where I clearly bit off more than the members in the audience were able to chew. And I was told that. I'll be attending the Harper Jordan Blue Symposium in Minnesota this next weekend, along with the Allies for Racial Equity symposium or a joint conference that will be going on. We've introduced our congregation to the UU Allies for Racial Equity, a UU group building an anti-racist movement among white Unitarian Universalists. We formed a Moral Mondays group, an intentional white space, with an invitation to talk about racism. Our last meeting was the watch party for the babies and bailouts, where we raised $1,000 towards the fund to support mothers and babies. This year, we received a very generous bequest of $800,000, and we're in the process of forming a $100,000 high-impact community outreach fund. So while it actually felt good to put this together of the things that we've accomplished, what I'm left with and what we're left with is we are still a white, aging congregation with a black minister. I don't believe we have any arrogant people in our congregation, but racism, whether it's based from arrogance or ignorance, is still racism. Many that participate in social justice events come from outside our congregation, and they don't come to worship, while many who worship don't come to our social justice meetings. Our ethos around money is one of scarcity and lack rather than abundance and generosity. Moral Mondays fizzled because all but two of us didn't feel comfortable being in an intentional white space. We use the gray hymnal much more than the teal hymnal, and I'm sorry, folks, but the songs in that gray hymnal make me feel like a pilgrim. And I think music is an important part about our services, and we've got to figure that out. God bless our drummer today. At a recent service about lynching in the U.S., Kimberly went deep and talked about it, and after service, a couple of members said to me, God, did she have to really beat us over the head with it? And I said, you should talk to her about that. I think she'd like to have a conversation with you. No one has. Dealing with white entitlement is intimidating, awkward, and full of stumbling blocks. We must be determined to do this intentional work, and we need to do this work with a fierce love. This work centers on releasing the chains of white supremacy while intentionally creating action that builds truly inclusive, beloved communities and creating opportunities to be on the right side of history. And we're going to keep trying. Out on the table is a little piece that I wrote called "The White Supremacy Peel: A Message to White People." I'd invite you to pick up a copy if you'd like to. Thank you very much.
Awesome. All right, next I'd love to hear, we have a threefer, Stories in Immigration Justice from Jude and Deborah Little and Claire DeRoche.
You know who your friends are when they make you go first. So, I'm Deborah Little from the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship at Stony Brook. This spring, we received an award along with these two congregations from Long Island Jobs with Justice for our work. For us, it was for our work on immigrant rights and the interests of undocumented immigrants. So I'm going to start with successes. We have a group of members who are actively involved in supporting the accompaniment project of Jobs with Justice. That means going with undocumented immigrants to everything from traffic court to their hearings in front of ICE. It makes a huge difference, if any of you have ever not done it, to have faces that look like ours in the courtroom when people are in front of judges, immigration judges. You don't have to say a thing, just being there is huge. Like a number, I think, of our congregations, we're pretty good at giving money. So we regularly support the Solidarity Fund, which is a fund that JWJ has to help families whose breadwinner is in detention or has been deported. I think really our biggest success is that we have partnered with members of 4 other faith groups in our community, Presbyterians, Quakers, and Catholics, and some non-sectarian groups as well. And we have founded the North Brookhaven Sanctuary Cluster. So in the 3 years of our existence, we have done a number of things. Some of it is called Migra Watch, where you literally are sitting outside the house of an immigrant who is threatened with being picked up, and you're kind of the watch for that person. Rapid response, where you go out to be witness if there is, a raid. We've done some Know Your Rights trainings and others trainings. We've also prepared ourselves in the congregation to support the sanctuary church that is in our community, which is the Presbyterian one. Challenges. Sometimes your partners aren't quite on the same page as you, so we have prepared to transport immigrant children, if their parents are picked up, to take them to a guardian. But then we just learned that the lawyers are still very anxious about having those conversations with their clients, so they aren't doing the paperwork yet. So that is work in process. We, like the congregation we just heard about, there's been some complaints about too much social justice services, such that the minister actually had to count the number of social justices she was giving to make sure that, to check the reality, shall we say. And third is we're so small, we're so tiny. There are 4 of us who are are regularly close to burnout, and there's another 4 to 6 who participate. And so for us, constantly, the challenge is to get more bodies in the room, maybe with a trade-off of the money. So that's the ongoing challenge.
Hello, everyone. It's great to see you all here. I'm Claire DeRoche, and I'm the Social Justice Coordinator for this congregation. With the election of Trump, the need to walk with the immigrant community on Long Island only increased. And as Deborah said, we are blessed by the work of Long Island Jobs with Justice. Through them, our congregation has participated in accompaniment training, provided space here for that training, and for Jobs with Justice's annual conference, and contributed to their Solidarity Fund. We also entered into the conversation of whether or not we could, should, would become a sanctuary congregation. We thought we might be a natural choice since we have all this space. For a year, the Social Justice Committee investigated this possibility and held conversations with congregational leaders. Then, at an island-wide convening of immigrant advocates, I posed the question to them: is UUCSR well situated to be a sanctuary congregation? Their answer was no, because of our location. We're not on the bus route, we're not in the middle of an immigrant community. If you are a sanctuary congregation, you need to be accessible to the local community so that anyone who is in sanctuary in your congregation can receive visits from other family members, from friends. So their answer was no. And they urged us to work in other ways. And so that's what we have done and what we are doing. At least some of us are. We really, as Deborah said, we really too need more people doing this work. And you can see me, you can see Diane Haney. Where's Diane? There you are, chair of our Social Justice Committee, if you want to talk about that and learn what you could do. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Judy Gauger. I'm the minister serving the UU Fellowship in Huntington. I could almost just stand here and say ditto to what Claire and Deborah had said. So much of it's the same. So I won't go into those specific details and talk more about process and challenges. First off, it takes a lot of people. Many of the folks in our room from Huntington, Diana Weaving, Helen Boxwell, Mary Beth Geither, and others like Steve Burby, who aren't here today, make this possible not from just sheer amount of work they're doing, but it's all about linkages. It's about being connected in the community, knowing all the power players, knowing the nonprofits, and not taking the lead, not being the place that comes in and saves the day, but the place that comes in and says, hello nonprofit, hello community group, what do you need from us, and how do we follow lead with you? There are other structural things around a congregation that's worked well for us. Any issue around immigration rights or working on economic rights for us has worked well, where the minister may preach on a topic, and then you're partnering with a community group that comes in, that then leads a forum afterwards. That's how we built up the accompaniment program, where we had, I think, about 30 of our members get trained, doing the work that Deborah was talking about in her congregation. The other sides of it, there are challenges that come up that for boards with all of this work, that how do you navigate it? And often you're not going to know how to navigate it until the challenge pops up. I think about sanctuary, and for us, this was an issue that was a real challenge. We also run a cold weather men's shelter, and one of the concerns was, how do we offer sanctuary and not also put at risk our ongoing ministry around supporting the needs of migrant workers? And we ultimately decided with a lot of reluctance and not a total agreement to work towards sanctuary with supporting other congregations that are better set up. And we would focus on the accompany work, and we would focus on that shelter work. But there's an old, 25 years ago, I remember as a UU in Morristown, any issue you want to do, you need to have a congregational vote, you need a long process, and then next year you need to do a different thing. And we even decided to go with the flow. Like, this is where the energy of our members are, and this is what the world needs and where we're situated. So anything tied to immigration rights, immigration justice, there's no more votes. We're just moving and making connections and shifting over time and getting to the point where, like, one of the staff at the Jobs of Justice was with Helen and I at an anti-bias task force meeting in Huntington at our fellowship. And he's like, I should probably join you all now because I've been in this building so many times this week, I might as well become a member. And it's a powerful thing to be in that kind of ongoing relationship. But for just like Reverend Margie, there was a point along the way where I had members actually tell me I was preaching some justice too much, and I had to count also how many times. Magically, after Trump was elected, now people are not asking me to count how many times. They want me to do it more often, right? But it is not always shiny, it's not always pretty, it's not always everyone agreeing, and it's often, you have to make this work, you need a lot of powerhouse leaders who also are not always going to agree with one another, but still agree with the general outreach. Thank you all.
Great. So we're going to continue along with Tom Check, who's from First Unitarian Brooklyn in Brooklyn.
So there's several of us here from First Unitarian, and I'd like them all to raise their hands so you could talk to any of them about. Everybody from Brooklyn, raise your hand. Any of these folks can talk to you about the things that I'm going to describe to you. And I'm going to touch on two things. Briefly, I'm going to touch on the work our congregation has done with Beloved Conversations. I know Linda Anderson is going to speak at greater length later about Beloved Conversations. But then I'm going to go into more about the way we form linkages with communities of color outside First Unitarian and how that's made a difference to us. On Beloved Conversations, we had our first training of a group 2 years ago. That was very meaningful to them, and then they expanded last year and had 2 other training groups, which included all of the white members of the Board of Trustees. And as you'll see later, that's made a difference in terms of the readiness of board support for a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about. I'd also say that the 2 big learnings that they had from Beloved Conversations are to become aware of microaggressions. We heard a little bit about that this morning. Those things that unconsciously are going on and unconscious to white people, but very, very visible to people of color as offenses. So microaggressions, and secondly, that white people need to do their own learnings about white supremacy, about microaggressions, about how we're operating, and not be reliant upon people of color to be telling them. So white people doing their own homework. And that comes in a little bit too in what I'm going to say. So that as one backdrop, and then I'm going to talk about the things that we've done and where it stands with our outreach to people of color or communities of color outside of First Unitarian. And those are really 3 different programs. The oldest, most long-standing of which is one with the Muslim community in Brooklyn. The second one, also of long-standing but newer than that, is with the Haitian community, primarily in Queens and Nassau. And then the third, which is the newest one, is working with new immigrants, new arrivals to the United States that are seeking asylum. So I'll talk about each of those and how they've learned from each other, where they stand. So the first one was really right after 9/11. 9/11 in 2001, when the Muslim community was under tremendous pressure and receiving a lot of the blame for 9/11. One of the members of our congregation, who has just this past year passed away, really reached out to leadership of some Muslim community and mosques in the area and said, what can we do? What can we as First Unitarian do to help take some of the pressure off of the Muslim community? What they came up with was a dinner in the month of Ramadan, which that year fell in December, which gave them some time to prepare. You know, in Ramadan, there is fasting during the day, and then at sunset, then there are prayers, and then there's breaking the fast with a meal. And that's often a community thing. And so for one of the days of Ramadan, whatever month of the year Ramadan fell in that year, we at First Unitarian have hosted a Ramadan dinner with our Muslim neighbors, obviously providing food that's sensitive to Islamic dietary restrictions, no alcohol, no pork. And it very much is a sharing. The organization and the execution of this, however, is very, very much shared. The presentations, the discussions, the prayers, the speeches, what have you, are all alternating between the Muslim leadership and the First Unitarian congregants. So it really is a coming together. And one of the things that's been significant is that year after year this happens. We've now had it for 19 years. It happened this year, just last month. And it's something that's become very important to our congregation. And people from the congregation go, people from the Muslim community go, and we get to get familiar with each other over time. So that kind of repeated pattern over time has made a big difference. And it's something concrete. It's not a big ask for people to come to the Ramadan dinner this year, and it's something that's intriguing. So that, I think, has had staying power, and it's built a connection with an intact community outside of our four walls. The second one that built on it was with the Haitian community, which is that in 2010, there was a hurricane that really devastated Haiti, both economically and ecologically. Haiti is fairly steeply wooded, forested, and the hurricanes really wiped away a lot of the topsoil. So besides the immediate economic impact, it also made agriculture very difficult. And our board of directors really wanted to do something about that. So they went to support the Haitian community. And so they reached out again to the group that was sponsoring the Ramadan dinners in the relationship with the Muslim community. And that group was able to find an organization called FADADSE, which is made up of people who have immigrated from the southeastern part of Haiti and live now in the New York area, but go back frequently to help with reconstruction or help currently with reforestation and general improvement of the place that they came from and the place that they in their heart is their home. Those folks, many of them live in Queens and in Nassau. So it's a similar sort of format. In the spring, we host a dinner. Again, with foods that are of welcome to the Haitian community, and again, the program is really shared. This one has less speeches and more entertainment, singing, dancing, music, and again, it alternates the performance. The performers alternate between people from First Unitarian and people from FADADSE, from the Haitian community, so that it becomes a sharing, equal planning, and equal ownership, really. And there's very much a sense of an intact community at First Unitarian connecting with an intact community that's not First Unitarian and coming together as equals. That, again, has become very important to the congregation. And again, it's built long-term relationships. You see the same people year after year. The third thing is newer, and like the last discussions we just had, has to do with immigration. And it was really after the election and after Trump's inauguration, beginning of 2017, we, like many congregations, were wondering, what can we do to help with the ease the situation that immigrants are now going to be under with this new administration. It's going to be even harder for them than it already was. So we went through a congregational discernment process for the better part of a year, really, with the help of UUA resources and other people in the community, and ended up bringing to the congregation a proposal that we worked out with a lot of meetings with what we called cottage groups within the congregation, like little forums. And in the end, the congregation voted overwhelmingly that we wanted to become a sanctuary congregation. We don't have showering facilities, so we can't entertain anybody for very long, but for short periods of time, up to a few days, we could provide an emergency place, a safe place for someone to be who was under immediate threat of detention or deportation. And that was something the congregation really embraced in a big way. We found that the reality is that that's not where the need was. And the actual need was with people who have recently arrived or applying for asylum, don't know anybody in the community, need to get a foot on the ground. And so what that's morphed into is our providing support in terms of housing in congregants' homes, in terms of financial support, helping make connections with lawyers, with medical assistants, it's things like that, for folks that are actually are starting their process of applying for asylum. And that's a smaller retail thing. It's a couple, right now we're supporting a woman from Cuba, we're supporting a father and son from Guatemala. Starting next month, we'll be supporting an LGBTQ person from Mexico. But it's very real. And again, it's asking, what can we do to be helpful? Not us being the ones that know the answers, but what can we do to serve? That again has drawn in tremendous dozens and dozens of people from the congregation when there's a need, and it's actually become something that sort of defined our self-identity. As we've needed board authorization to expand parts of that program, I think that the work we did with Beloved Conversations has been really helpful. It's helped the board to say, look, this is the kind of thing we want to do. Let's not get too hung up in process and deliberation. Let's go ahead and do this. And I think that learning out of Beloved Conversations was very helpful. So that's how those two threads have come together for us. So thank you.
This has been so interesting. We have 4 more great stories to share. So next, I'd love to hear from Claire DeRoche. Again, we are a fully Claired experience today. She does not get another present at the end, but we are going to hear about a fabulous project that she was able to put together right here at Shelter Rock.
Yes, I'm still Claire. I'm going to tell you a story. Here at UUCSR, although we did not recognize it at the time, our anti-racism and ending white supremacy work began in earnest in 2012 when the Social Justice Committee began education on mass incarceration and solitary confinement. Participation in the common read of Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, opened our eyes to the issue of mass incarceration. We began to educate ourselves and the congregation on the history of mass incarceration, how the United States is an outlier in its incarceration practices, and how mass incarceration disproportionately affects Black and brown communities. Even though turnout was often low for the programs we offered, we knew we had to persist. Concurrent with this awakening, a member of our Social Justice Mental Health Subcommittee brought to our attention the fact that incarcerated people with mental illness were being housed in solitary confinement. Investigation of this practice led us to involvement with the New York Campaign for Alternatives to Isolated Confinement, the statewide coalition working for the passage of the Halt Solitary Confinement Act. We joined the campaign and have been working for the passage of this legislation ever since. 7 years is a long time to work on an issue, and many times some of us have been tempted to give up. However, the example of those in solitary and their loved ones on the outside who continually work for change urges us on. In 2015, as a result of the hunger strike by people incarcerated and held in solitary confinement in California's prisons, an effort known as Together to End Solitary Confinement was created as a way to keep the issue of solitary in the public's eye. Each month on the 23rd, symbolic of the hours each day a person spends in solitary, We hold a vigil of remembrance, naming and lighting candles for 23 individuals enduring the torture of solitary confinement. We follow this with a program such as a conversation with a directly affected person or with an educational video. This has given us the opportunity to examine issues of racism and white supremacy on a monthly basis. Again, turnout for these programs is low. There have been occasions when only 2 or 3 people showed up. However, we have not dropped the program because we feel it's important. Even as Together to End Solitary Confinement was getting going, the Black Lives Matter movement was beginning. In November of 2016, Reverend Oscar Sinclair, who was a ministerial intern here at UUCSR, led a well-attended series, Being White in the Black Lives Matter movement. This opened our eyes further to the need for white people to address racism and white supremacy. On a parallel track, our Social Justice Committee was also examining the global refugee crisis. We formed a task force named Courage to Defy Hate and began to address the global refugee crisis. From 2016 through 2018, we held educational forums, raised money for local refugees, and took training to work as volunteers with Catholic Charities of Long Island in their refugee resettlement program. Then Trump was elected, and soon the refugees stopped coming. In 2018, Catholic Charities had to close its Office of Refugee Resettlement. Members of the Courage to Defy Hate Task Force saw that we needed to reinvent ourselves. And in 2018, we became the Racial Justice Task Force under the umbrella of the Social Justice Committee. Once again, we held educational programs, including screenings of 13th by Ava DuVernay and Strong Island by Long Island native Yancey Ford. We were fortunate enough to have him attend our screening and discuss this important film with us. Throughout 2018 and 2019, our ministers preached some challenging sermons on racism and white supremacy. Reverend Ned White reprised the series Being White in the Black Lives Matter movement with updated content, and Reverend Natalie Fenimore offered a program on Black UUs in our that's redundant, in our movement, sorry. In the spring of 2019, members of UUCSR participated in Beloved Conversations with members of 3 local UU congregations. We also worked very intentionally to strengthen our relationship with the Long Island organization Erase Racism. On the drawing board now is a 3-session educational program facilitated by 2 members of the Racial Justice Task Force and based on the material provided by the 1619 Project of the New York Times. In 2019, realizing that one of our weaknesses was the lack of opportunities to get to know local communities of color, the Racial Justice Task Force decided that reaching out to local Black-led organizations serving predominantly Black communities might help. From our contacts, we drew up a list and began meeting with these leaders. The goal was to discover ways in which we might partner with them. 3 groups stood out: the Elmont Cultural Center, Choice for All, and Lytic House Community Center. The Elmont Cultural Center is the brainchild of Mimi Pierre Johnson and her husband, Stan. Mimi has roots in Haiti and Stan in Cuba. The philosophy of the organization is a hand up and a hand back. Mimi and Stan established the Cultural Center because there is no community center in Elmont. Brown and Black people in the community were losing their sense of identity. The Elmont Cultural Center seeks to be inclusive and support the diverse communities in the area, especially the youth. Choice for All is located in the predominantly Black South Shore community of Roosevelt. It focuses on ensuring that every child has access to great schools, that families are supported, and that communities are healthy. The founder, Jacob Dixon, chose establishing this organization over getting a master's degree at Harvard. The center integrates direct services and policy work that is led by and for the families served on Long Island. In the spring of 2020, Choice for All will move into the Hagedorn Hub, a multi-purpose space for families and social justice on Long Island. A third organization we could partner with is Lytic House Community Center in Port Washington. Lynette Batts, who is also Jacob Dixon's mother, is the executive director. They have many programs for both adults, youth, and children, and in talking with Lynette, I saw many possibilities for volunteer work with them. And in the initial conversations we had with all these leaders, they expressed openness to partnership with us. All of this requires that we leave the comfort of our familiar surroundings and cross the boundaries that segregation has built in Nassau County and across Long Island. I wonder, are we equal to this challenge? Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. Next, we'll hear from Eddie Freed from the UU Congregation of the Hudson Valley. There he is.
Hello. I'm Eddie Freed, as Megan just said, from the UU Congregation of the Hudson Valley, located in Croton-on-Hudson in Westchester County. We're a church of about 100 members. Our family has been UUs for 30 years, 25 of which at the Croton UU. I've held many positions over the years, including board president. My wife and I were OWL teachers for 20 years. Currently, I'm serving on the social justice and worship committees. All of my early adult life, I participated in diversity trainings. Then in November of 2007, an event changed my orientation to issues of race. There was a cross burning 1 mile from my home, the home of a young Black family just 1 mile from my home and 2 miles from our church. Upsetting events like this are usually reported in the newspaper or television, usually far away, not so close to where we live and breathe. I needed to understand how such an event, a cross burning, could happen so near my home and church. In the process of exploring this incident, I went to a community gathering of over 400 people, where 15 officials from the school district, the town, the county, the state, each assured us that this incident was an aberration and not deserving of more attention than they were already giving issues of race. Of course, that's not how they said it, that's how I heard it. Then they put out a microphone for community comments. I heard stories of what persons of color and biracial families experienced routinely in our town. I was stunned and speechless for days as I tried to sort this out. I knew I had the responsibility to partner with others to change the world. I envisioned having grandchildren, now I have 3, and grandchildren of others, little children, inheriting a world so dangerous and unfair. I had to do my part to change the world for the better for these beautiful babies of all colors. Soon I talked to many people, especially in my church, about this experience. Our then DRE and now Reverend Peggy Clark took me to a discussion group with Ron Chisholm, one of the founders of the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. I was stunned and speechless for days as I tried to sort this out. I joined a new local anti-racism study group that partnered with a local black activist group and heard more about living black in our community. I was stunned and speechless for days, and then I began to get angry. With the minister of a nearby UU church, we started Westchester UUs for Racial Justice. After about 3 years, attendance at our sessions diminished, and that minister finished her work at that nearby UU church and left. Westchester UUs for Racial Justice died. While looking for an accountability group for the Westchester UUs, I volunteered to check out the local branch of the NAACP. After attending a few monthly meetings and forming deep friendships with some members, I joined the Peekskill branch of the NAACP. Eventually, I agreed to co-chair their health committee, and now I also serve on the executive committee. The friendship with the members of the NAACP is mutual, so when I start talking about anti-racism, they tend to look at me funny and think I'm that odd white guy who is part of us. They seem to humor me. The NAACP, in my experience, is aggressive in its work for civil rights, but does not really buy into anti-racism. Through my church, I learned about and eventually joined the Anti-Racism and Diversity Committee. People in this room remember that? The ARDC? A few heads are nodding. Of the then New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut region of the UUA. The committee was fondly called the ARDC. There I met and worked with some impressive individuals, including Reverend Dr. Michael Tino, Reverend Dr. Hope Johnson, and Dr. Janice Johnson. Familiar names? Yes. Despite many invitations, no one from my church joined me. The ARDC sponsored numerous activities, including an annual conclave, which, like today's event, invited people from all the congregations in the district to focus on anti-racism. A few from my church attended, but never the same group, and no one with an apparent passion for changing the world. A number of years ago, some of us considered posting a Black Lives Matter sign outside our church. After much discussion at the board and at open church membership meetings, we borrowed one of Katie Aliberti's spare signs at that time. I guess she used them up. And posted it inside our church. After many meetings, trainings, and also a consultation with the local police department, a vote was approved that we get our own BLM sign and post it outside our church. Since our church is up a small hill from a major roadway, we hung our sign down the hill a bit on the fence surrounding the child's play area, probably 60 feet from the roadway. Got a few angry calls, which have long since ended, no damage to our sign. After the excitement of the new sign faded, nothing much happened. Despite an annual summer lay sermon on racism for the last 6 years and periodic classes in adult RE, not much is happening. This year, I led 2 classes on anti-racism and 24 members participated. And last Saturday, I organized a 4-hour workshop on faith-based anti-racism. I invited members of the 5 UU churches in Westchester and 6 houses of worship in our village of Croton. 19 attended the program, representing 9 churches. 3 of those in attendance were also active members of the NAACP. I intend to personally follow up, especially with the individuals of each of the 9 houses of worship, and bring anti-racism program to these churches. I'm constantly on the hunt for one or more partners who want to change the world. Recently, I was asked to kick off an anti-racism program where I work. Our not-for-profit healthcare organization has 1,300 employees in 30 locations. My most intensive learning occurred in our AR planning group, which is intentionally composed of a black man, a black woman, a white man, a white woman. I am that white man. We meet weekly and once or twice monthly have a facilitator. Over time, this AR planning group has developed sufficient trust for my black counterparts to begin to share the routine disappointments, pain, and sometimes outrage that they and other POCs experience working for our good liberal organization. I'm allowed to hear some of the barrage of microaggressions committed by me and other white, well-intentioned leaders like me. I apologize for my offenses and say thank you for sharing. Each time I present at my church, the attendees approach me afterwards saying variations of, "You were great." These words of appreciation do not make me feel good. I deeply prefer for people to ask me follow-up questions or concerns about their own experience with race and racism, or even to challenge me and say that I have it wrong. I usually blame myself for not getting through to my church family. Our new minister is very supportive, and we may introduce after-church discussion groups recurring at least monthly. So far, it looks like it might be climate change and anti-racism, so maybe we'll get to meet every other week. She agrees with me that we have a lot of work to do. I will learn from today's workshops and panelists. I'll try to figure out how I can better help light a fire or find those with a fire to continue this necessary work. Churches and all houses of worship can be a perfect place to cultivate and sustain anti-racism work. They all seem to address values in making this a better world. They tend to attract people who care about others. A faith-based anti-racism coalition has been formed with the support of the New York Anti-Racist Alliance and the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. If you worship in Westchester County and you want to be part of building networks of support across faith-based organizations, join us on Wednesday, November 13th from 2 to 4. If you have a church that is ready to commit to becoming an anti-racist church, please join us Sunday, November 17th from 2 to 5 in northern Manhattan. You will need to bring a team of 3 to 5 ready to work on developing and implementing a strategy to become an anti-racist church. Brochures for both events are available at the registration counter, or see me or contact me at arcroton@gmail.com. Thank you for your interest.
I'd love to hear from Reverend Dr. Linda Anderson, Long Island Area Council, or LIAC.
Take a breath. Like enough oxygen that you won't all fall asleep. I'm the president this year serving the Long Island Area Council. That's 11 UU congregations on Long Island. And Long Island is not called Long Island for nothing. It's 100 miles long. And no matter what time, day or night, there's a traffic jam. So we are challenged, we 11 congregations. But last year we did Beloved Conversations. And it was the seed for my wardrobe today. It says, Long Island Unitarian Universalist for social justice, siding with love. You too can have one of these shirts. It was a project that we undertook as LIAC, as the 11 congregations. But what is Beloved Conversations? Maybe not everyone knows. It's a program that was developed by Mark Hicks. It's administered by the FOS Collaborative. And it is an 8-session program that begins with a day-and-a-half retreat that gives us an opportunity to learn about history, learn about the history of our areas, examine our own attitudes and learnings about race, and then think about what we can do in our congregations. So we did it as LIAC, as Long Island, and people from 8 of our 11 congregations participated, and there were about 40 of us who did it. Long Island has these 11 congregations, but most of them are small, I mean like 10 people. So we needed to band together. We're very aware of that here, because if we don't, we're doomed. Most of the congregations on Long Island are small. Only 3 have full-time ministers. And so we did this together as a cluster, 100 miles apart, traffic jams apart. So we had 3 groups, one in the east, one in the middle, one in the west, and we met. It gave us a sense of community. It gave us a sense of doing things together. It was a great undertaking. It needed a lot of planning and that kind of thing. And Kimberly Quinn Johnson and I were the 2 who nudged everybody to do this. The success is that we did it. It's as simple as that. That every group had people from at least 2 or 3 different congregations in it. We got to know each other, we did something together, we examined something together, and it led us toward now, this year, we've actually hired someone to be our social justice coordinator. And we have t-shirts, and hoodies are next. But the struggles are very real. I asked all of my co-facilitators to talk about their experience, and I'm going to read a little bit of what they said. We took lightly the advice to not run a group unless you had more than one person of color in that group. And I think our group suffered for it. They suffered in any number of ways for it. If I'm remembering from our debriefs, having one facilitator and one person of color in the same group was not sufficient. Groups need to have more than one participant of color. There's a challenge there in situations where, especially on Long Island is one of the most segregated areas in the country, where you just might not have more than one participant who is a person of color. And then what do? You tell them not to come? You tell them they can't be part of it? What do you do? That remains an open question. We want to offer this program again, and that's a real, what do we do? What do we do about that? Another facilitator felt there needed to be more context around why white folks need to shift their perspective and why white supremacy is detrimental to humankind and Unitarian Universalism. And others remembered other seminars they took at other seminaries where the leaders spent more time at the beginning highlighting the history of the legislation and the profound inequity and prejudice and injustice that comes from white supremacy. But in our beloved Conversations group, we didn't feel that we had enough of that grounding. So in our groups, we were all over the place, which I think is inevitable, that you're going to be all over the place. But it made it hard because while you might have a couple of people in a group who understand microaggressions and are a little bit attuned to them and hopefully attuned to when we do them, and you have other people in the group who never heard the word, and you have other people in the group who argue against it because the intent was not to offend. It's hard to bring a group like that together as a group. And we met as small groups for 8 sessions. We had to be a group, and we had to try to achieve some coherence. And it's really hard. I think everybody knows that. It's really hard because we're not on the same page. I'm not sure we can ever start on the same page, but we were hoping as facilitators, perhaps with a little more background and a little more grounding, we might have been on page 100 and 107 instead of 100 and 306. It was hard. The curriculum itself was overstuffed. We became really kind of weird, at least Kimberly and I, who facilitated a group together, about time. Okay, we're 30 seconds over, oh no. We got there. Those who were in our group know that, and you guys are here. The curriculum itself was overstuffed, and that put pressure on us, and we didn't feel free enough to modify it. And we didn't, how modify it? You know, it's a very well thought out curriculum. We had a lot of struggles. We had a lot of challenges that continue to exist. Another thing is that when people didn't have a lot of experience with the background of white supremacy or even why we're doing this, but nevertheless we're part of beloved Conversations, they fell back on personal experience. And are you giving me a signal? Oh, you're scratching her nose, okay. They fell back on personal experience and anecdotal experience, and we all do this. What happens to me, I assume, happens to everybody. I'm universal. I'm the universal measure. But in a conversation like these we were having, we can't do that. We have to be able to see and believe what other people are saying. So that was another way that background knowledge of racism as systemic and the lack of it tripped us up and made the groups a little bit harder, made for some resentment within the groups, which made all the facilitation harder. And one other thing that we experienced, 4 of us facilitators were ministers, and 3 of us had people in our congregations as part of the group. And that became tricky sometimes. As maybe you want to say something, or you don't know how to say something because you have a relationship with people that goes way beyond the Beloved Conversations group. So for the facilitators, and I imagine for participants, how do you navigate that? And I think that all of these things, in terms of not being on the same page and a lack of background knowledge and assuming that our experience is the experience of everyone and dual relationships, I imagine that extends out to a lot of this work and not just Beloved Conversations. And these are challenges, I think, that we all face and can help each other through. But we have to name them and face them. Would those of you who were in the Long Island Beloved Conversations raise your hand? Because quite a few are here. And if you want to talk to anybody about it, please do. I recommend the program highly. It's hard, but absolutely worth it.
Last but not least, it's you, Kate. Woo! From Fourth Universalist Society in the city of New York. Come on up.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kate. I'm from Fourth Universalist, where I'm a congregant, and I do a lot of the work with the young adults as well as some of the work with our justice team. Am I, visible? Okay. So our story begins in a place that, especially because I'm going last, is very familiar, which is shortly after the 2016 election. To set the scene, Fourth U finds itself with a brand new senior minister, a young white man, a racial justice task force that's a remnant of its past self, and a desire to revitalize our justice work. From this desire, a few things happened. We kind of brought back our justice team, we started a rapid response network, and for this story, most importantly, our senior minister began meeting with a variety of local community organizations to see how we could get more involved in the work of justice. One of those organizations was Faith in New York, which is an interfaith coalition in the city that works for justice. They had begun a campaign called Faith Over Fear to address the uncertainty that the Trump administration might do to immigration justice. Meeting with them led to us going to their meetings, led to them asking, would Fourth U be willing to serve as short-term sanctuary if needed? Short-term is a few days, maybe a few weeks, but small. It was a case of perfect, some might say divine timing, that this request came exactly 1 day before a board meeting and 2 days before a congregational meeting. So despite some concerns, as was echoed already, we did not have shower facilities, etc., the board agreed that saying yes to this request was the right thing to do. A resolution was drawn up, and the very next day at the congregational meeting, it was universally approved, or unanimously approved. So before the end of 2016, on paper, Fourth U was officially a sanctuary congregation. It wasn't until a year later when we would be called to put that commitment into practice. Now, in the intervening year, a lot happened. The vote received a bit of press coverage, and our building was vandalized with carvings of swastikas and Nazi hate speech. We then held a vigil with community partners, local religious communities, politicians, public figures, our congregation, our neighbors, and it filled our sanctuary and created healing and beauty amidst this chaos and pain. Around this same time, with the turmoil within the UUA, Fourth U aligned itself with the Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, and we led the white supremacy teach-in. That teach-in began our intentional efforts to confront white supremacy directly within our congregation, and that effort has been largely embraced with a few exceptions. Now, back to that call in early 2018, it was a request for sanctuary for a mother, Aura Hernandez, and her 2 children. Aura had a harrowing story, but she really wanted to make a public stand by entering sanctuary, and could Fourth U be her temporary home? Now, this request raised some issues. Again, it wasn't a short-term situation, so there would need to be major building repairs to make the space livable, long-term support systems that needed to get set up, and because of the urgency and confidentiality of the request, it meant we had to proceed without congregational approval. Ultimately, the board agreed that if we couldn't be relied on to step up, then we only cared for justice work when it was convenient. and not long after, Aura and her family arrived at night. Fourth U met her and her family the following Sunday at a special surprise service addressing sanctuary. Volunteers were requested, and a sanctuary team coalesced, primarily Spanish speakers and other moms close to Aura's age. They formed teams to address the many different needs, such as food, supplies, socializing, press, ESL, counseling, medical care, fundraising, and legal support. That's not the full list, FYI. And from this work, a two-pronged strategy was developed to support Aura and her case. The first part was to pressure the government through the press and elected officials to grant a stay of deportation. This strategy was really pushed for by the organization that placed Aura and her family with us, which was actually not Faith in New York. It was a different organization that we were connected with. And this strategy did gain us a lot of attention. It got us a lot of press. It gave Fourth U a nice spot in the light, but it didn't do very much of anything for Aura and her family. The second part, championed by our sanctuary team, was to ensure she was in the best position possible to be granted legal standing in the United States. Now, as you can imagine, there were both expected and unexpected challenges with this long-term sanctuary. There is the emotional toll of being confined for long periods of time, for so very long, and this led to Aura and her family wanting to leave the building at times, and those were really challenging conversations that needed to happen. And part of addressing that was prioritizing bringing community to the church, and it was also making sure that there is counseling to address the trauma that Aura had experienced on her journey to the U.S. and this continued new trauma of being in sanctuary. There was lost income from an event partner who rents out our building, and we get a lot of annual income from, and there are some issues with them claiming loss of business, and we did lose a decent amount of income from that. There was also tension that developed between the teams advocating for those two different strategies. This ultimately led to Fourth U taking over control of all aspects of Aura's sanctuary, and when that happened, things did move quickly. Her new legal representation submitted several applications. They are all still in progress, and we're hopeful, she's feeling positive, that she has a strong application for asylum. And that is about all we can say about that, because the thing with sanctuary work is while parts of it are extremely public, we were in the New York Times, there has to be comfort with not knowing and with a bit of secrecy. Now, I'd be remiss to end this story here without placing our sanctuary work within Fourth U's longer, much more complicated history with race and racial justice. It would be really easy to rest on the laurels of our sanctuary experience, and in fact, we have done this in the past. So our last minister was the first clergy of color to serve Fourth U, and one of her struggles was that the congregation felt anti-racist by proxy. Yeah. Similarly, we also, after the white supremacy teach-in, we hosted Beloved Conversations, and while it was both well-intended and well-attended, it really ultimately created unhealthy dynamics that just further unearthed the deep and broad internal work that Fourth U needed to do in its own house, right? So the decision to house Aura in her sanctuary was part of aligning our actions with our words and representing this work. Since then, we've had some other things that have come into play through training, policies, and community building. So our senior staff now regularly receives anti-racism training. They recently did an all-day one. And after Beloved, our DRE and music director, both of whom are experienced educators, designed a racial justice curriculum tailored to our community that builds language and capacity for understanding systemic racism, as well as language and strategies for actively anti-racist institutional transformation, and that is in its second run right now. There have also been changes in policies to center our commitment to diversity and confronting white supremacy. And as a result of many of these, several people of color in the congregation came together and asked and formed a POC affinity group that was mostly well received. They're going to be leading a service in mid-November on what it means for people of color to claim space in our predominantly white congregation and denomination. Thanks to dedicated staff and lay leadership and a young and relatively diverse membership, our anti-racism work continues, and there are some specific areas of growth that we're focusing on in the short term. First is embedding anti-racist structures into the DNA of our congregation itself instead of relying on the goodwill of white leadership. The second is acknowledging the reality of having an all-white ministerial leadership, senior and 3 affiliates, and being aware of what that presents and what that means and what prejudices and inherent or implicit things brings in. Continuing to center, integrate, and develop avenues for leadership in the congregation when formal structures do not exist. And lastly, building accountability to people of color and affected communities. Now, in the end, looking at our sanctuary work as one part of our larger anti-racism journey, it achieved several things. Number one, we gave the family the best shot that they had of gaining legal status in the US. We lived into our values as UUs, even when it was risky, legally and otherwise. We didn't lose sight of the individual and the family and centered their feelings and desires and needs. And we contributed to the local and national conversations in regards to the unjust treatment of undocumented immigrants. For us, there is no greater moment than when Aura and her family joined the congregation as members. Fourth Universalist for them had become not just a physical home, but also a spiritual one. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a lineup. And I don't know about you, but I heard so many different kinds of things, right? I heard some rather overwhelming lists of amazing accomplishments, and I heard some real struggles, and I heard some questions about, like, how can I do this work? How can I keep doing it? How can I keep doing it effectively? How can I keep doing it when no one's helping? How can I keep at it? And I think that points to a lot of variety and a lot of work, and also to the depth of liberation and hope that's behind all of it. So can we give another round of applause to that work? Yay.
I'm grateful to have been invited to be here today, to share with you, and to sort of just eavesdrop on some of your process and the struggle that you're involved in. It is not easy, but it is good work. And so I wanted to leave you with something else from my journal. We seem to be really standing between two spheres, and I think I would be calling them heaven and hell, really. Because when we are able to walk this path and we start to see a break open, it feels like it's heaven. And when we look at what needs to be done and we see what's happening around it, it's the other place. I believe in heaven. I know it's there because I'm walking on it. I believe in hell because oftentimes I'm living in it. Our cities teeming with poverty for people who never knew they were poor before civilization. At least they had their own, but now they get to own the dirt and the filth and the disease and the dis-ease with the crime and corruption. Their grandparents have perished into dust, and they were forced out of their heaven into this Western sort of hell to languish and be used over. But I still believe in heaven. I know it is here, it is now, it is with us and the work we do and the being with other creatures, living in our cycles of birth and life and death, being rebirthed and renewed. We are partners in this heavenly march, seeing each other, loving each other. We learn the lessons that the creatures have to teach us, that the winged relatives, that the four-legged relatives, and we who are the two-legged, we all learn from each other. and we are thankful for the gifts they provide. We wait upon their answer, and we only take what is needed. We never take all. We must respect these green relatives who provide sustenance for us all. Preserving heaven is to live in balance. Creator shows us what we need to know. We allow ourselves to listen and to observe. Every moment is a teaching. These things make us better humans. I believe in heaven. We can make it real for all of us by living in a sacred way. I believe in heaven. I won't make for others a hell, lest it fall to me as well. Go forth with your work. You're in it. Do it. Live it. Love it. Give it. You got it. Ashe.